Alright guys, today I'm going to be creating database schemas for different tasks, and we're going to be using relational databases, and we're going to be using SQL for that. And so before we do that, let's look at the task. So the first task is going to be an expense tracker application, and the requirements are the application should allow you to create an expense tracker category, for example, entertainment, dining, travel, etc. Each category should have a category name, category description, creation date, and the user that created it. The application should allow you to create transactions under each category. Each transaction should have corresponding category description about the transaction, transaction amount, transaction date, and the user who did the transaction. These four are the ones that we're going to work on today, and then in our future video, we're going to create the Spring Boot application for this database. But today we're only focusing on the database. So before we make it in SQL Yog, before we do that, let's create a basic diagram, diagram. Okay, so we're gonna need multiple tables for that. So there's going to be a categories table, because you have to have a category with category description, category date, and the user that created it. So we're gonna have to have a category name. Actually, you know what? Before category name, we need to create one thing, which is the most important thing: the category ID, because the ID is the most important thing. So yeah, the ID. The ID is going to be the primary key of all tables, so we're going to put a P next to them, which means it can't be null, it has to be unique. And we're going to put it on auto increment, which means it's going to generate a value automatically. So for the first record, it's going to be 1, second is going to be 2, 3, it works like that. So then it's going to be name, date, description, then the user that created it. So user is actually going to be a foreign key, because we're not going to actually store user in the category name. So for that, I'm going to create the users table, which is going to give us the username. But for that, we're going to have a users table. The users table is actually pretty simple. It has a primary key ID, which is going to help us access the username, and then we're going to have a username, which we're going to fetch. This category table is going to fetch user from the users table and then get the username from here. Okay, and then the last table, which is going to be the transactions table, it's also going to have an ID, of course, and this table is also going to have a primary key ID, but this table is actually going to access two foreign keys: the category foreign key and the user foreign key, which your category is going to come from here, category name, and then user from here. And then it's going to have a description for the transaction, the day, and all that stuff, and the amount for its own table. This category is going to come from here, name. The user is going to come from here, and this user is also going to pass here. So yeah. Okay, so now we're using MySql database to create this, and the client that we're going to use is SQL Yog. Okay, so let's create. Actually, I already have this created. Expense tracker DB. Okay, never mind. That already has the stuff created in it. Let's create node database, and I'm gonna call it expense tracker. Not forget create. Let's create a new table. The first table we're going to create is users, because the users table is giving information to every other table. So I'm going to use users. We're going to create a column name ID, and the data type that we're going to use for that is going to be an int, and we're going to make it primary key, because ID is always going to be number, so it has to be an int. And we're going to make it auto increment, so which basically means is that it's always going to have a value. It's going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and goes on. And this is why, and since I made a primary key, it automatically did not null, because The ID is very important, so it cannot be null. That's how you put an auto increment as well. Then the last column for the users table is going to be username. Okay, we have username, but this is actually not going to be because it's a name, so it's going to be varchar, which means alphabetical stuff, and we're going to give it a length of 20 because we're 20 letter username. We're also going to put it on not null, and you can save that. Actually, before we save that, let's make that user ID to make it more clear. User ID. Now we can save that. Okay, now we're going to create another table. Create table. Now this one's going to be the category table. Categories table. And this one's going to also have a cat ID. Cat ID. Category ID. It's also going to be an int data type. It's also going to be a primary key. Also an auto increment for the same reasons. Category name. Category description. And a category date. And then this one's actually also going to have the user ID because we need the ID. And the ID is also going to be int because it has to match from the foreign key ID so it can access it. And then this is going to help us get the name. And then this is going to be varchar because again it's a name, and the length is going to be 20. And this description is also going to be varchar, but this one's going to be 50 because you could write a paragraph as a description. The category date is actually going to be date because there's a data type named date, so yeah. Okay, we have the table here, but it's not done yet because we actually have to reference the foreign keys from here. We're going to make a constraint fk underscore user underscore ID. It's just, you could name whatever you want, but that's how I name my stuff. Table, you're going to use the table user ID, and it gives you the column that you're referencing to in the users table as itself. Okay, so we have all. So now this table is ready. Before we insert data, we have one more table to create, the transaction table. Transaction. Okay, so for the transaction table, we need to have a trans ID again. Trans ID. The ID is going to be an int type. It's also going to be a primary key, also auto increment. Now this actually is going to have the category ID because we're going to have to fetch the category name, so we're going to use the category ID to do that. It's also going to be an int, and we're going to have, what else do we need? Yes, a category, a transaction description, transdc description, varchar description, so 50. You could make it whatever you want, it's up to you. Trans amount, we have a transaction amount, which is going to be a doubles because an amount could be in decimals. For example, if it's in cents, you're gonna need double. Okay, and then before we finish the transaction table, we're gonna have a user ID in here because we're gonna have to know which user made the transaction. And this one's actually gonna have two foreign keys, so fk underscore user 2 underscore ID, referencing column user ID, users. FK stands for foreign key. Now this is actually going to be from the cat table, so category and then ID, and then we're going to point it towards the category ID. Now if I click on category, yep, there we go. Data type, oh, okay. And there we go. Okay, we got two foreign keys and everything. Okay, now let's start inserting tables into these tables. Inserting data into these tables. Okay, so first let's try to insert data into the categories table. So click open table. That's on auto, you can see, because we put it on auto generated. Let's give a dining is going to be the name, and then description is going to be just had dinner. Date is going to be pops up a calendar for us to choose the date. I'm just going to choose this. Then user ID is null right now, and if I try to save this, it's letting me because, well, that's fetching from there. So to make that actually work better, I made a mistake here. Let's hit alter table. Alter table. We need to make this not null, because if it's null, then that's not a good thing. We can't have it being null. Okay, if I do that, I'm gonna have to go here. Okay, so I kind of made a mistake, which I shouldn't have. So if I make that, okay, it is not null. What is wrong with that? Okay, just leave that for now. We don't need to worry about that. Okay, so if you see that right now, it's null right now. This value is null right now because this is actually a foreign key, and we actually haven't defined any users in the users table. So let's open the users table. The ID is auto increment. So now if I put this value here, for example, just say my name, okay, that's right, Kasha. And now if I come here, user ID, it's gonna be, we're getting the user ID from there. So if I put in user ID 1 here and save this, yep, we get an error, because if we see that over here, we actually haven't saved the information here, so there's no information for it to get, and there is no user ID 1. So now if I do this, I hit save, we have user ID 1. So now if I go here, try saving this, it should let me. ID 1. Now it doesn't give us an error. So now we can access the username from there in our Spring Boot application. Okay, we're gonna insert data in the transactions table. That's ID. Let's just put in 1 for this. Transaction description. Just spent $20. Okay, transaction amount. We're gonna make it 20.0 because it's double, so you can add decimal. User ID is gonna be 1. This shouldn't give us an error because we have defined both user IDs. Alright guys, so just to recap on what we did in this video, we created a database for an expense tracker application. We used MySql database, SQL client. We looked at some constraints. For example, we looked at the foreign key constraint, we looked at the primary key constraint, we looked at auto increment, we looked at not null, we looked at unique, which comes with primary key. Yeah. So yeah, if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe, and to give me some feedback, make sure to comment down below.